Sergeant Nick Morgan, who tonight is, as we speak, undergoing reconstructive surgery to repair damage done to his lower orbital after being trampled on by mounted police when he demonstrated against the Iraq War. He's an Iraq War veteran outside the presidential bait at Hofstra University. And if you want to see that incident, you can go into YouTube and type in Iraq vet crushed by police horse at presidential debate. Sent me by email a question that he wanted to ask each of you about the stripping away of constitutional rights through, of course, as you mentioned, the Patriot Reform Act, but as well the President's signing statements, which have allowed George Bush to essentially disobey more than 750 laws enacted since he took office, the FISA Reform Act, the suspension of habeas corpus, the open use of torture in our offshore penal colonies, and of course the recent decision to station a combat brigade on American soil, ostensibly to quell any potential civil unrest. Sergeant Morgan asks how, given these egregious erosions of our rights and the fact that these were passed in many cases or supported by a democratically controlled Congress, what mechanism do we have to roll back these curtailments of our civil liberties and see constitutional guarantees reinstated? And I think, Mr. Baldwin, you are first.
All right, thank you. It flows in nicely with what I just said. I am convinced that all that you just suggested is a very real threat to America. What good is it to fight a war for democracy, in quotes, halfway around the world, to turn around and here in the United States of America take away, steal, abrogate the rights and freedoms that are enumerated for us in our Constitution and Bill of Rights? And that's exactly what's going on, as you just suggested. I'm very concerned about this, and I really believe that every conservative, every person that would claim an allegiance to constitutional government would have to be concerned about it. Personally, I'm a little alarmed that many of the evangelical Christians and people that call themselves conservatives have just kind of rolled over and played dead as they've watched President Bush do the things that you just described. We should all take it very seriously when any of our civil liberties and our individual rights as enumerated in the Bill of Rights are taken from us. As President of the United States, one of the first things I would do is I would review all of the signing statements and executive orders that have taken place over the last several administrations, the Clinton administration, the two Bush administrations, and probably wind up reversing about 95% of those. I would like to restore habeas corpus. I would like to restore the Fourth Amendment. I would like to overturn the Patriot Act. I even have serious reservations about the Department of Homeland Security. I think that the people who are concerned about our country becoming a police state, I think those concerns are very valid. And I think it's ludicrous that we who call ourselves conservatives would stand back and allow this to happen just because it happens to be a professing conservative who's at the top of the ticket.
Thank you. Mr. Nader.
The Conservative American Bar Association, 2005-2006, has sent 3 white papers to George W. Bush declaring in detail systematic violations of our Constitution. For example, snooping on millions of Americans or lots of Americans without judicial approval. Now, that means that the criticism of the Bush administration for violating our Constitution has gone mainstream in the legal profession. What we need to do first is demand that the impeachment authority be exercised by Congress. Pelosi and Reid, when they took over the Congress in 2007, took impeachment off the table. The way to reinstate a tradition of constitutionalism is to punish the president and vice president for 5 systemic high crimes and misdemeanors: criminal war in Iraq, systemic torture, incarceration without charges, denial of habeas corpus, spying on Americans without judicial approval, and the signing statements that you just mentioned. The second is the people of this country, zeroing in on their 2 senators and representatives, have got to get statutes enacted that make these constitutional provisions enforceable in courts of law by citizens. Right now, citizens have no standing to sue. There's no enforceability. You're more likely to get penalized if you violate a traffic ordinance than if a politician violates the Constitution. And then third, and very important, is that We need in this country to have direct democracy. If the Congress does not enforce the Constitution, we have to have procedures for binding national referendums with access to the mass media. And I also have one quick bill we're going to talk about in a few days. Anytime Congress and the White House engulf the United States in a war abroad, all able-bodied and age-qualified children and grandchildren of all members of Congress, President and Vice President, are immediately drafted into the armed forces. That will focus them on the declaration of war authority being held in Congress under a deliberative process, not given arbitrarily to George W. Bush in defiance of our framers of our Constitution.
Let me ask both of you, and maybe we'll begin with Mr. Baldwin. When you look at these bills, from the FISA Reform Act all the way to the Patriot Reform Act, do you believe that they were passed, or certainly that the architects of those bills wrote them and passed them primarily to deal with the potential of terrorism on American soil, or to curtail the civil liberties of Americans who are carrying out their constitutional right of dissent?
Well, Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, he talked about if these things, these abuses that he referred to, if they were sporadic, you might get the idea that they were not orchestrated. But when you begin to see a design behind these things, you have to conclude that there is something more than just a sporadic, accidental theme going on. It seems to me that we are inching closer and closer and closer to a police state style form of federal government. And I do believe that there is a design behind it. I don't think it's accidental. And one of the reasons I say that, in the Patriot Act in particular, if you recall, Chris, back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was in the White House and the Republicans were in Congress, the same piece of legislation was introduced by the Democrat administration. The Republicans rejected that bill out of hand. They saw it for what it was, an abridgment of our constitutional freedoms, especially the Fourth Amendment. And so it was defeated. But then after 2001, and President Bush is now sponsoring this bill, now then you have the Republicans in the Congress as well, and they pass the legislation. They called it the Patriot Act, but it was the same piece of legislation that came before the Congress in the 1990s. So again, it wasn't just a reaction to 9/11. If it was just a reaction to 9/11, then why was it introduced in the Congress a decade earlier?
Mr. Nader.
Well, I think in many ways what has happened is that when there is an attack like 9/11, and the government is expected to respond, and it responds with a whole series of restrictions that facilitate dragnet enforcement, which is very inefficient and violates the civil liberties of a lot of innocent people. In this round, it was Muslim Americans, for example, who were thrown in jail without charges or habeas corpus rights. When that happens, we have to ask ourselves, what are the collateral benefits to George W. Bush or whoever is in the White House? And here are the collateral benefits. He concentrated more power in the White House at the expense of Congress and the courts. He chilled out the Democratic Party and stifled dissent in the country because it's all terror, terror, terror. The third is he distracted attention from the necessities of the American people by focusing abroad, Osama bin Laden, Osama bin Laden. I mean, look at his speech records. They're huge references to this criminal gang. Far more than references to the health, safety, and economic well-being of America. And finally, he makes his corporate buddies incredibly rich by the expansion of these budgets like Homeland Security and Department of Defense. That's the danger of out-of-control and disproportionate reaction to this attack, in that it centralizes power in the White House and reduces our democratic processes at an accelerated rate that we would never have foreseen. That's why the American people have got to have a force field if we have another terrorist attack, stateless terrorist attack, or another one. We have to have a force field so that we don't turn into a de facto police state.